Hey there, everyone. So Palestine has been in the news for several months now, and of course, it has been in the news for at least 50, 70 years. But considering all the different comments that have been made regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict, I think it's pertinent to just lay out some of the facts of the treatment of Palestine from the Israeli point of view, and also the sort of post-colonial perspective on groups like Hamas or Fatah, and talking about what does the future of Palestine really look like. If we want to look at how Palestine actually came about, you have to look towards the end of the 19th century and towards the beginning of the 20th century, when the Ottoman Empire is starting to crumble. And certain Western powers like Britain and France have a number of concordances with Arab chiefs and kings and whatnot. You have the famous Mahmoud Hussein correspondence, for example, which is one of these principal affairs in which Britain, for example, colluded with these Arab leaders and said, if you will help foment nationalist revolution in your area to weaken the Ottoman Empire, we will help support you in that. And trying to basically create this fervent nationalism in the Arab world that didn't really exist. You know, nationalism is a modern phenomenon of the idea that my identity is chiefly, for example, as an American. It's really not. My identity more specifically is as a Southern American, or as a man, or, you know, there are a lot of other identity categories that don't reduce to nationality. But nationalism became very common in the 20th century and really, you know, has become one of the defining geopolitical constructs kind of governing world affairs. So after these revolutions have happened and the Ottoman Empire has been dissolved, promises were made by Britain and France to gain independence to these Arab territories, which did not happen. Oftentimes they were either delayed or they never took place. So, for example, in the case of Palestine, it became part of a mandate system by the British, which mandated territories that were overseen by British rule in the Middle East. So, for example, you had Mandatory Palestine, which was kind of then split into Palestine and Transjordan. And early in the 20th century, we can see a number of factors. One is extreme anti-Semitism across Europe. This was, of course, one of the chief factors allowing for people like Hitler and the Nazis to rise to power, is there was a need to place blame regarding, for example, the belated rise to power of Germany and Italy. They had not really been kingdoms with a kind of national basis for as long as France or Britain or Spain or Portugal had. And as a result, you've got all this turmoil happening, lots of changes happening in the world, a kind of growing global expanse of politics, and there's a need to place blame somewhere. And all throughout history, these scapegoats have been different, but the Jews were a very prominent scapegoat and still are to this day. And of course, this is one of the prominent aspects of Nazism, is this anti-Semitism. This need to place the blame primarily with Jewish people, but also with other inferior people such as homosexuals, such as people with mental or physical disabilities of some kind. And this anti-Semitism feeds into the policy in the Middle East in a number of ways that must be pointed out and must be kept in mind today, especially since anti-Semitism is constantly a term that is thrown around to try to put people under the bus, whereas actually it's being volleyed in such an unreflective manner is actually very detrimental to the place of Jewish people today and in history. So this anti-Semitism exists, and as a result, there is the famous Balfour Declaration from 1907. And this is written by Charles Balfour, a British official, stating that there will be created a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It's important to note that it does say in Palestine. So Palestine is understood as an entity of its own, but one which British authority could overwrite and make into a national home for the Jewish people. And this may sound really nice at first, but actually, this is a form of anti-Semitism. Because what it did is, instead of trying to address the problems of anti-Semitism, it said, you know what we're going to do? We are going to actually be anti-Semitic by pushing all the Jews out of Europe, like everybody wants, and put them in a confined space in the Middle East where they'll be away from us. And there's a good precedent to be made, for example, with Charles Balfour's open anti-Semitism, that was one of the primary undergirding qualities of the Balfour Declaration, and thus of the initiation, kind of on a worldwide scale, of the creation of the nation of Israel. And of course, a number of different people have lived in the region of Israel/Palestine for a long time, right? I mean, it was predominantly Jewish around the time of, like, when the Bible is being written and whatnot, in the Torah. And then various things take place. Roman authority comes in. All this changing of power is going on, and it's changing hands. But in the modern world, it is recognized that Palestine has been Arab for a very, very long time. In terms of modern precedent, Palestine is an Arab territory. And that does not mean it was housed exclusively by Arabs. There was a lot of, for example, kind of wasted land that nothing was being used for, that Jews would gradually start to migrate towards Palestine and establish homes there, right? To try to get back to their ancestral homeland. And Zionism, this is a term that's thrown around a lot, but if you're not aware, Zionism is the political ideology that vies for the creation of the state of Israel, of a nation state for the Jewish people, and most notably for the Jewish people alone. So in that regard, Zionism is about creating an ethno-state, just like the Nazis with the Aryan race, right? It's just a slight difference. But it is important to notice that although it seems on its surface that Zionism is a reaction against Nazism, in many ways Zionists use the same tactics as the Nazis, as Hitler, as anti-Semites in doing their bidding. So Zionism is becoming popular, and you have people like Herzl, for example, who are sort of these founding figures for establishing the idea that there needs to be a mass immigration to Palestine in order to create land settlements and in order to hopefully make that a Jewish land solely. And the Balfour Declaration is one of these moments where we get some international precedent for the creation of said state of Israel. You have Britain actively acknowledging the desire to join in on this Zionist project. And in many ways, Zionism itself can be seen as anti-Semitic, insofar as it is, in its historical setting, using the momentum from anti-Semitism for the need to get Jews out of Europe, to put that into a project to settle Arab land in the Middle East, namely Palestine. So the British have this territory mandated, and they decide that they are going to split it up such that there are certain areas which are Israeli, certain which are Palestinian. Not a lot of it is Palestinian, by the way. And then Jerusalem being a sort of medium zone in between, where there's kind of a cohabitation of some kind. They weren't really sure how this was going to work. You know, you've got all kinds of enclaves like this. Like, for example, you have East and West Berlin, that was kind of, you know, an enclave within a divided Germany, and no one's kind of sure how that works, because it's always a little strange, to be right in the middle of these differences. But then over time, the Israeli state gets established in 1948. And this is backed by Britain, and this begins the long oppression of the Palestinian people. Shortly after the declaration of the independence of the State of Israel, you have the Nakba, or the catastrophe, in which you have hundreds of thousands of Palestinians displaced from their homes by Israelis who come in from, Jews who come in from other places and identify as Israeli. And they come and they displace Palestinians and they build homes on their land. Right there and then, that is injustice. That is settler colonialism in its essence. And of course, Britain would be on board with this settler colonialism. And one of the common objections from the sort of Israeli side here is, well, Israel has always been Jewish land. It just needs to come back to its original owners. And the problem is, this identification with Israel as Jewish land, and solely Jewish land, if you look at some of the Israeli policy regarding the future of the State of Israel, it is clear that they want it to be only for Jewish people. There is no option for Palestinian people, only Jewish people in Israel. The problem is that when we try to reach so far back in history for a land claim, we come to a fundamental concern, one logistically, of, well, who particularly has the right to this land? Because many of the displaced Jews, since the time when it was, a majority Jewish place, well, they're dead, and their lineages live in Poland, in Ukraine, in Armenia, in Georgia, all other places aside from Israel. And they don't really identify culturally with a lot of the Israeli customs and ideas of the time. And in modern geopolitics, if we reach too far back for a land claim like that, we get to the problem of, well, okay, all Australians leave Australia because that's a settler colonial state. Americans all leave the United States because this is a settler colonial state. Same with Canadians, right? It becomes this disaster of, we've reached a point where we are too far gone to just rewind. And to ask for a rewinding would actually do more harm than good, as we can see with the Nakba. This was a chance to try to rewind and try to get Palestine to become Israel again. But the problem is, it's not Israel anymore, it's Palestine. It is lived in by majority Arabs. It is filled with a cultural milieu that is no longer exclusively or majority Jewish or Israeli. And once again, this does not mean that Jews don't live there. Christians, Jews, Muslims, this is kind of a conflation of religious and ethnic identity that typically happens when we're talking about this area. All of these people lived in relative harmony, especially under the Ottoman Empire. But then these tensions are suddenly ignited by this incursion of Zionist ideas, of British and French influence, and all of this land being mandated allowed for a clean transition of power from the Ottoman Empire to being overseen by British and French rule. After the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East kind of gets put into two camps, one overseen by the British, one overseen by the French. So from there, it's a very easy step to take these Zionist ideas that already exist in Europe, co-opt them to lead to the expulsion of Jews from Europe and the establishment of a settler colonial state in Palestine, that being Israel. And then if we look at the modern Israel-Palestine conflict, we can see that it has completely devolved into a state of genocide by the Israelis on the Palestinian people. There's a lot of very interesting maps you can see to look at the diminishing land claims by Palestinians in Palestine, for example, by the actual stuff that is de jure Palestinian, meaning that by law, and then also de facto Palestinian, in terms of are they able to control the land. And this is gradually diminished to the point where now we have the occupied territories. And they are called such because they are occupied territories. Palestine is not internationally recognized as a state because of Israel's reticence to accept such a fact, to accept the possibility for mutual understanding and cohabitation in the region. And as such, we have primarily today the West Bank and Gaza. The West Bank is primarily overseen by Fatah, which is a secular Palestinian political organization that was founded by Yasser Arafat, one of the famous Palestinian leaders involved with certain accords to try to make some mutual understanding of peace in the region as the 20th century comes to a close, and it is understood that Palestinian people are on the losing side in terms of military force. The Israeli army has become very strong. For example, they even invade Egypt at a time, which is a whole other thing that we can get into another time. But it's very clear that Palestine is shrinking. So you have the West Bank, which is governed by Fatah, and then you have Gaza, which is primarily governed by Hamas. And one of the questions regarding Hamas is, are they a terrorist organization? Are they just a political party? Are they freedom fighters? Are they something else? And this is one of the important things to keep in mind. One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. It all depends on your perspective. And this is why it's important to have a historical understanding of Hamas, for example, such that you can say that, yes, October 7th, the attack done by Hamas in Israel was a tragedy. It killed thousands of people and took hundreds of hostages and was not a moral act in and of itself. But in light of Israeli oppression, since, at least probably in 1927, we can really see damages being done to Palestine, and especially by 1948 with the Nakba. There is a large historical precedent of injustices being done to the Palestinian people, and Hamas, as well as Fatah, kind of came up as liberation forces. That is how they see themselves. And of course, the important dialectic here is to understand the kind of objective outside point of view, or as objective as one can be, and the inside perspective of they understand themselves to be liberation forces acting for the self-determination of the Palestinian people. That is what they want, is the thing that especially the US has loved to talk about, the right of people to self-determine. And yet, when it comes to Palestinians, no, they don't get self-determination. In fact, they get to be settled, they get to be murdered, right? They get to have outside laws imposed upon them that they did not consent to. And as such, Hamas sees itself as a liberation force. And in part, I would agree with that, because it is very clear that if we look at the state historically, ethically of Palestine, they deserve the right to self-determination and to their own state, free of externally imposed oppression. That is a plain and simple fact that I think everyone can get on board with. And if you think that Palestinians should be completely removed from the region, then we have a sort of oppression the likes of which we haven't really seen in its particularity since the Nazis. The establishment of an ethno-state to the detriment of the native people. And of course, this is the sort of aftermath of settler colonialism in general, is it doesn't really matter about the people when you can frame your mission in such a way that you deserve this land and you can claim it's yours, whereas, that's the Israeli side, is they claim that this is their land, and Palestinians claim No, this is our land. It has been for hundreds of years. You can't just come in here, kill all of our people, starve us, detract all of our water in the region, detract supplies for medical necessities, for building houses, to take all this away and just say, no, that's our land. So in the modern situation, Hamas has become one of the predominant kind of opponents in this conflict. Is you have the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, and then you have Hamas. And they are kind of warring in, by the way, Gaza is really, really, really tiny. It's just a few cities, a few miles, but it is some of the densest populated areas in the world. And this has been forced on the Palestinian people because they have been gradually forced out of the areas that they lived in historically and pushed into these new territories backed by the mandates of the British. And of course, the US have become the main backers of Israel, becoming the largest cumulative benefactor of US foreign aid in the history of the United States, to the tune of billions on billions of dollars. And America has always had a interesting relationship with Israel, partly because of our strong evangelical Christianity culture in the US, which has an obsession with bringing on the end times, one of the prerequisites for that end times being the establishment of the state of Israel being in the hands of Jewish people. And as such, there's sort of a pernicious undercurrent of why the US is so involved in Palestine, but also it's just to maintain their hegemony across the globe. And Israel is, really, it's a sort of strategic asset in a field of countries that don't care for the US anymore. Places like Iran, which revolted against US imperialism and intervention in '79, against Iraq, against kind of Saudi Arabia, although they're more sympathetic to the US, especially Lebanon. Hezbollah is a very prominent political party and organization, which I've done a lecture on, which you might want to check out, because this is one of the primary powers assisting Hamas in defending Gaza. And one of course, the key factors in understanding Hamas is that they are an Islamist organization. They explicitly framed their mission through Islam, through a duty as Muslim people to establish a Muslim state. And that I do not agree with. I do not think theocracy is a good idea. It's not a good idea for anyone in the picture. For example, people who want to talk about establishing a Christian theocracy in the US, the same arguments can be levied against them, that even if you think this is a great idea because your religion will reign, in fact, it will be someone else's version of your religion, some particular sect that will likely not agree exactly with what you believe in, and thus you've given the power to a very small sect which can now rule over you with the zeal that only religion can give. And of course, I don't support Hamas in that regard. I don't support Islamist politics. I don't think this entrenchment of religion and nationality is a great idea. I think it serves to create these artificial boundaries that are going to continue to create conflict. But I do support Hamas's mission for Palestinian liberation. And today we have seen Israel act to systemically block all access to water, to food. They've tried everything they can to keep foreign aid from entering Gaza, as the world committees of sorts have become aware of the situation in Gaza, that they need aid imminently. Israel has done everything they can to block that on the grounds that this aid is actually harboring technology and materials for Hamas. And this is one of the classic Israeli lines today, that everything is for Hamas. Every hospital has tunnels under it that Hamas is in. Every hospital is some sort of founding place for military strategy for Hamas. every building is Hamas owned and run. And of course, this is an exaggeration, but this is the justification for every single bombing of every single innocent civilian is, oh, it was probably Hamas. That does not fly in the international committee because Israel has not shown themselves willing, and the ICJ, the International Criminal Court of Justice, has been on the side of the argument I'm making that they have not shown proper discretion and taken the proper precautionary measures to ensure that those places are actually Hamas run. They've sort of gone with this blind mentality of if there's a possibility for Hamas being there, they might as well be there. And therefore it's justified to raze Gaza to the ground. And if you look at pictures today of Gaza, of Palestine in general, you'll see what I'm talking about. And then if we look at the actual layout of Palestine with the West Bank and Gaza, there are not many roads connecting both of these territories together, and they are monitored, they are militarized by the IDF, by the Israeli Defense Forces. And there are numerous checkpoints created, especially in the West Bank, but also in Gaza, because the West Bank is very kind of emptied. It's been kind of hollowed out like some piece of like cheese or something. It's quite a kerfuffle in terms of geopolitics. There have been a system of very intricately designed checkpoints, which also use facial recognition, by the way, to ensure the restriction of the freedom of movement of the Palestinian people. So we have the restriction of movement, the deprivation of basic food, water, other necessities, and we have a targeted way to exterminate or expel the Palestinian people from their homes, all of which taken cumulatively together is the recipe for genocide. So that being said, I think it should be clear to most, and unfortunately it's not, and this is one of the caveats that needs to be made, being for Palestinian liberation is not anti-Semitic. Because what's the argument that's usually made? If you're for Palestinian liberation, this means you are against the Jewish people having a home. No, it's not. Don't listen to people who tell you that, because the actual pernicious undercurrent there is equating the genocidal actions of the state of Israel, right, of this political entity which claims to speak for the Jewish people, which it doesn't. There are plenty of Jews who are anti-Zionists. You are equating these genocidal acts of the state of Israel with the Jewish people themselves, which is perhaps the most anti-Semitic statement that you can make. To give the state of Israel a blank check to do whatever they like is to say that you condone this being an essential part of the Jewish character, that they have a right to genocide. And that is unconscionable to me. And it should be unconscionable to you if you claim that you care so much about getting rid of anti-Semitism. Being for Palestinian liberation means you are for the right to self-determination of all peoples, regardless of race, creed, religion, color, whatever it may be. Doesn't matter the place or the time. People have a right to this. So that being said, it should be clear that being for Palestinian liberation should be a worldwide accepted phenomenon. Like I said, unfortunately, it's not recognized as ubiquitously as I would like, but nevertheless, having this consciousness being raised to the need for Palestinian liberation will likely be one of the key things that each individual can do as just an isolated individual to hopefully affect some sort of change. I'm not going to comment on the difference between a one or two state solution. I think unfortunately it is likely, more than I would like, that a single Israeli state is an imminent future possibility. But I would hope that a two-state solution of some kind would work. Ideally, we would want to run back the clock to 120 years ago, when Palestine was Palestine, and Jews could live there, Arabs could live there, Everyone can live there, but it's not being mandated as a Jewish ethno-state. Ideally, that's what you would want. But even within the last 120 years, there's so much precedent that I think a two-state solution is the only realistic solution, even if it's not the most just solution. And as such, I hope this has given some kind of background on the creation of the State of Israel. I've done a lecture on U.S. imperialism in the Middle East, which may be of some benefit to you, talking about not only the kind of end of the Ottoman Empire and the establishment of the State of Israel, like I've talked about, but also the Iranian Revolution, also Hezbollah, also decolonial movements in general in Algeria and Tunisia and Lebanon, and all this stuff. That may be of some use to you if you're interested in this. Check out any of my other lectures that I've done on postmodern philosophy, German idealism, gender theory, other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you just want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.